A piece of history from this Central European country mostly known for neutrality and tax evasion coming up. What is up, guys? My name is John with PewPewTactical.com, your definitive source for gun reviews, gear guides, and all things expensive antique pistols that fire cartridges that are obsolete. And in saying that, I know I'm gonna piss off the one dude that is gonna scream about how viable 30 Luger is as a cartridge. If only they would modernize it. Without a doubt, the Luger is one of the most iconic firearm silhouettes of all time, and that's just due to the fact that it was the standard military-issued sidearm for Germany, Switzerland, and a whole lot of other countries for close to half a century. The gun's distinctive toggle action represents a now mostly extinct branch of small arms development that's quite unique operations-wise from the current standard slide action of pretty much most pistols in existence. Though, for the time, it was nothing short of revolutionary, even if it wasn't the first handgun to utilize it. Taking the existing toggle lock weirdness of the Borchardt C93, itself realistically the first successful and mass-produced self-loading pistol around, Georg Luger began making small tweaks that would eventually come to resemble the Luger we know and love today. While the Borchardt was generally regarded as accurate with a high rate of fire, it was also unwieldy and expensive to produce. And when Borchardt refused to modify his design to address concerns raised by the Swiss army during their initial trial phase, German arms manufacturer Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken, or DWM for short, hired Georg Luger to implement the suggested tweaks for them. Notably, the Borchardt C93 featured some pretty unexpectedly powerful recoil, and in attempting to address this, Luger created the 7.65 by 23mm cartridge, utilizing a different powder charge and shaving a whole 2mm off the Borchardt cartridge, thus allowing the gun to utilize a shorter stroke of the toggle action as well as a narrower, more angular grip as compared to the Borchardt's near vertical pistol grip. The changes would indeed pay off, and after aggressively pursuing military contracts for the new and improved design, the Swiss became the first military to adopt it in 1900. Chambered in Georg Luger's 7.65 cartridge, or 30 Luger as it's referred to here in the States, that's the exact pistol we're here to talk about today. With that bit of history out of the way, let's talk toggle locks. Easily the most distinctive feature of the Luger, the toggle lock system operates in a manner that's not too dissimilar from that of the human knee. When locked out and straight, it remains quite secure and sturdy, but when bent, it becomes increasingly easy to continue bending around that joint. The toggle joint in its straight position resists the directional force of the detonating cartridge, which allows the entire breech, barrel, and toggle to move to the rear on rails for about half an inch. It's there that the toggle begins to ride up on a pair of cams that break the toggle and induce that jointed bending motion, allowing the bolt to come rearward and the striker to be cocked. The spent cartridge is extracted by a combination extractor and loaded chamber indicator on the top of the toggle, and is ejected as the toggle nears the end of its rearward travel, and a new round is stripped from the magazine and chambered as the toggle is driven back towards the straight position by a spring. And if you're following along thinking that all of that sounds particularly complex, you are spot on. The Luger, even for the time, was regarded as particularly complicated, requiring a fair amount of hand fitting and very tight tolerances to achieve what it is designed to do. In other words, stereotypically German. The particular example that we've got here is indeed a 1906 DWM produced Swiss military contract model, and features the distinctive flowery DWM logo stamped on the toggle, as well as a Swiss military crest just forward of that on the chamber. From front to back, you've got a 4 3/4 inch barrel featuring a rather tall bladed front sight on top. As mentioned, the entire barrel assembly reciprocates rearward ever so slightly when fired, riding inside of the frame's rails. Just below the space where the frame and barrel assembly meet sits a small, intricately knurled takedown lever, and just below that we've got our oddly aesthetically pleasing trigger guard. Just aft of that is the magazine release, again with some complicated knurling for a more positive grip, and just behind that is a gorgeous pair of original checkered walnut grips. The magazine well here is very, very narrow, and the 8-round magazine features a spring-loaded button that depresses the follower to facilitate easier loading, as well as a wooden base plate and 2 small circular button things for grasping when inserting or removing the mag. A grip safety at the rear disables operation of the trigger unless depressed, with an additional manual safety lever sitting just above it. The toggle can be manipulated via the two enormous knurled, grabby donut things at the top, by utilizing a sort of T-Rex claw and using your thumb to exert counter pressure on the plate that the smallish rear sights sit on, which itself flips upward as part of the toggle's operation when fired. And lastly, a small bar loop is provided for lanyards at the rearmost part of the gun. At this point, I'm assuming you're probably curious just how well century-old handgun tech actually works, and so were we. So we tracked down a few boxes of .30 Luger and went out to the desert to set about figuring out just that. First impressions are weirdly positive. The big takeaway for me right off the bat is that the gun points very naturally, which I'd imagine is owed to the general grip shape and the fact that most of the gun's weight winds up near the rear. As one might imagine, if you're already used to the muscle memory associated with modern handguns, the transition here might be a bit jarring. But weirdly enough, I found that you actually can get a pseudo high and thumbs forward grip on the Luger if you're really intent on doing so, which I'd say is definitely not the case with most vintage Browning style sidearms from the same era, as you don't have to worry about the toggle action biting your thumbs whatsoever. The gun's trigger is a bit odd feeling in a way that's sort of difficult to describe, but I'll give it a shot. As compared to a modern trigger that will generally feature take-up, the wall, a break, and then a reset, the Luger's trigger has a few millimeters of take-up and then a more or less consistent amount of resistance the entire way back until a very not obvious breaking point. The reset is similarly subtle, generating a very light click that you're probably going to miss unless you're paying specific attention to it. That being said, however, these aren't necessarily criticisms, as the gun still feels super smooth, especially when you pause to consider just how antiquated the design is. The magazines, however, are an altogether different story. While our original magazine worked well enough outside of being a bit finicky when loaded to full 8-round capacity, our backup reproduction Metgar magazine is nothing short of terrible, refusing to function with more than 6 rounds or so loaded in the mag, and of those 6 rounds, usually only feeding a few before the follower got stuck. And again, fully aware that it's a bit silly to be evaluating antiques from the precocious puberty phase in military pistol development by any sort of modern standards, but hot damn, a reload's a pain in the ass when you need to get mags this small into a magazine well that's barely larger. Leave it to the Germans to design an integral piece of the gun's operation around having millimeters of clearance to not fuck up. Then imagine attempting to make those mechanical actions work while under duress, and I think you probably get the point. Another bit of weirdness is the fact that the rear sights, as I mentioned, are part of the gun's toggle, which means that when fired, you momentarily lose your entire sight picture as the toggle breaks at its joint, and your rear sights are briefly pointed skywards. Now, it's not too big of a deal, and I think you could argue that it's not altogether dissimilar from the quick realignment that's going to happen when shooting a slide action pistol, but it is one of those things that you're going to have to get used to. While concerns about .30 Luger's stopping power, given the fact that it's a fairly small round, ultimately resulted in the creation of 9mm Parabellum as we know it, it is a pretty damn fun plinking round if you're not worried about storming the trenches with it, or whatever. It's altogether a bit softer feeling than normal 9mm, but one thing to note is that if you happen to have actual 9mm guns out and you are shooting .30 Luger, pay extra attention to not mixing your ammo up, as we had a .30 Luger round get loaded into a Glock magazine, and thankfully we caught it, but the Glock mag took it no problem and would have been able to take normal 9mm rounds right on top of it. So we have no idea what would have actually happened had the trigger been pulled on a gun chambered in 9mm but with a .30 Luger round in the chamber, and we have no intention of finding out. Thought the gun was gonna fall, but it didn't. Once acclimated to the Luger's idiosyncrasies, I found myself feeling reasonably comfy with it. Running our plate rack with ease, and handling longer range shots on steel torsos with maybe slightly less success. While staying focused on the front sight blade seemed to work great for the distances involved in running the rack, it felt like I couldn't really figure out where my POI was with anything past 30 yards or so, which I'm entirely willing to bet is my fault in one way or another, but felt relevant to bring up nonetheless. Yeah, boy. One thing I will say, however, is that the toggle action takes a decent amount of force to operate, and while you might think you've got it driven back far enough to chamber a round, you've really got to make sure you're muscling the toggle back to its rearmost point of travel, and it's usually just a tiny bit past where you might think that is. So where does all of that leave us? Again, I think this is kind of less of a review and more of an anecdotal storytelling exercise from someone who got to spend a little bit of time with a particularly well-maintained and cool bit of history. From the perspective of someone who's a bit of an avowed history nerd, there's something undeniably cool about getting even a modicum of first-hand experience with a firearm that, perhaps in the most minute butterfly effect way possible, played a part in shaping the modern world as we currently know it. If you're the type of person that might feel similarly inspired to type overly romanticized prose after a brief bit of time spent with an evolutionary dead end in small arms development, maybe you'll get as much enjoyment out of the Luger as I did. And the cool thing here is that if you're not particularly interested in snagging a flawless or super well-maintained gun, there are plenty of ratty Lugers floating around that are much more affordable than the one that we've got here. But be prepared to pay primo bucks if your inner spurg needs some museum-quality toggle goodness to add to your basement collection. Alright guys, that's gonna do it for us today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, I don't know what I'm doing with my hands, but you should take yours and put them on a mouse and subscribe to the channel. And then take your mouse and put it on the bell and click it so you get notifications when we post new videos. Because we've got lots more anecdotal storytelling experiences with turn-of-the-century militaria coming up at some point in the future. You can also take your hands and use them to access your credit card information and give it to us and buy shirts, the link to which is down below. Bye!